Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld and by Rabbi Rebecca Schatz.
As a way of getting into this topic, I want you to think about the number of different ritual and cultural traditions you know of that celebrate some sort of a light festival during the darkest time of the year, right? So we are about to pass the winter solstice, the day when we have the least amount of light in the sky, and either everyone's national and religious holidays happen to match up just perfectly around the same week, or there's something deeper and primal about pulling light from darkness that somehow made its way into religious and cultural traditions that ended up overlapping with each other in people's consciousness, but really just stemmed from the same human urge. And there are actually hints of that possibility, it's not a certainty, but a possibility in parts of the Talmudic tradition, including parts of the Talmudic tradition. One second. Sorry. Let me just turn off my notifications. Including parts of the rabbinic tradition that are familiar to you in terms of setting up some of the basics of Chanukah. So most of what we know about Chanukah from the rabbis are on about a page and a half or 2 pages of Talmud in around Shabbat 20, 21, 22. Right? Masechet Shabbat, the tractate of Shabbat, which mostly deals with the laws of Shabbat, but the Talmud goes off in tangents, and it has a section referred to as My Chanukah, which means what is this thing called Chanukah? And we're going to begin reading, and some of this will be familiar to you, or at least the impact of these texts will be familiar to you, even if you haven't seen them in their original situation. So the Talmud says, Tanu Rabbanan, which means we have a tradition from the era of the Mishnah, but which was not included in the Mishnah. So this is the rabbis writing in the 4th or 5th century CE, reminiscing about a text from the 1st or 2nd century CE from the era of the Tanaim, who wrote the Mishnah, but not actually included in the Mishnah. It means that there's nothing about Chanukah in the Mishnah. The first core religious text that we have from the rabbis does not mention Chanukah, but they wrote about it in that era. It just doesn't make its way into the tradition until the Talmud is codified. Mitzvat Chanukah, ner ish uveto. This might come as a surprise. The core mitzvah of Chanukah is for one person to light a light in his or her house for all 8 days, right? So you could get away on Chanukah with just having a single lamp or a single candle or a single thing of oil with a wick. And no matter what night of Chanukah it is, according to the rabbis, that's the core obligation of Chanukah. V'hamahadrin, those who really want to be lehader, to bring beauty to the mitzvah, those who want to make it a more special occasion, ner leil echad ve'echad, each night of Chanukah you add for every person in the family gets their own, but still it's only one. V'hamahadrin min hamadrin, if you really want to go to the highest high, but there's no obligation to do that, and I'll put in interesting parentheses, Chanukah, it's interesting that it's the holiday observance observed by an extremely high percentage of people who consider themselves Jewish, even those who don't consider themselves to be religiously Jewish, but only secularly or culturally Jewish. And yet nearly every person's observance of Chanukah is at the level of Mehadrin min Hamadrin, the highest level of the Talmud anticipated. And this is the culture that you know. Beit Shammai says, Yom Rishon Madlik Shmona, on the first day you light 8 in your Chanukiah, Mikan ve'elach pochet v'holech, and from there you continue to reduce by 1 each day. So on the 8th day you have 1. Beit Shammai would have had a very different looking Chanukah house than us. Beit Hillel Omrim, and the house of Hillel says, and this is what we do, Yom Rishon Madlik Achat, on the first day you light 1, Mikan ve'elach mosif v'holech. And from that point forward, you continue to add 1, right? So at the end of the section, you have the basic norm by which most Jews who observe Chanukah anywhere in the world observe it. Every person, whatever Chanukiah you have, each day of Chanukah, the light gets stronger and stronger. Now, built into the explanation for this, we have a window into a source for the length of the days of Chanukah that have nothing to do necessarily with the beautiful story we all were taught when we were 5 years old about the oil lasting more than one day. Okay, so look at the next section. Amar Ula. Ula is a sage from the Amoraic era. So this is the era of the Talmud, 100 or so years after the Mishnah. Pligi ba tre Amorae b'ma'arava. Two Amoraim, two rabbis from that generation, disagreed with this from the West. What's the West mean? We normally think of the land of Israel being in the East, but if you're in Babylonia, which is where this is being written, the West is Palestine, Israel. So Ula says there were two Eretz Yisrael rabbis who disagreed. What did they disagree? They disagreed not about whether Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai said what they said. That was not in a disagreement. They disagreed as to what was the rationale for their proposed ritual. Why Beit Shammai said you start with 8 and go to 1, and why Beit Hillel says you start with 1 and go to 8. Some of this will be familiar. Rabbi Yossi bar Abi and Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. These are the two Israeli or Israel, land of Israel rabbis who had this disagreement. This is a common approach in the Talmud. We have a disagreement between two rabbis. We say one of them says this and one of them says that, but the Talmud doesn't ascribe who said which and who said what, just that one of them said each of them. One of them said, you want to know why Beit Shammai did his Chanukah that way? Because he wanted the lights in the Chanukah to represent the number of days you have left. Remember, as a child, I remember once you hit the 5th night of Chanukah and you were halfway over, and it was depressing because you loved the fact that it was that you were going to be able to have the Chanukah lights and the songs and the dreidel and the gifts all 8 days. And once you got halfway through, there was a sadness that you were approaching the end. Beit Shammai says that the Chanukah should represent that reality, that we start with a holiday full, and it's like a tank getting decreased in its capacity because the holiday is coming to an end. So the candle should represent the number of days in Chanukah still yet to come. V'tama de Beit Hillel, according to whichever Amoraic rabbi this was, says no, well, not no, and the reason for Beit Hillel's wanting us to go from 1 to 8, keneged hayamim hayotzin, to represent the number of Chanukah days that already have been, right? And that's why we end with a flourish, because we have now been through 8 days of Chanukah, and our Chanukah represents that. Most of us would probably at least identify with that explanation for Hillel's answer, right? That you're building up a sense of the number of Chanukah days you have celebrated. But the other Amora said there's an entirely different reason explaining the 8 to 1 and the 1 to 8. Chad Amar Tama de Beit Shammai keneged parei hechag, which is in yellow because we're going to focus on that. One said, why does Beit Shammai go from 8 to 1? It has to do with the bulls of the holiday, to which your response is, what? Unless you're reading ahead or looking at the English. Like really, what? Question mark, exclamation point. What bulls? What holiday? How is this at all a representation of a Chanukah going from 8 to 1? Hold that thought. But Tama de Beit Hillel, and the rationale for Beit Hillel, Dema'alim b'kodesh ve'ein moridin, which is a beautiful semi-halachic, semi-kind of cultural concept in Judaism, that you're supposed to go up in holiness and not go down. And if your Chanukah is decreasing in its intensity and its luminescence from 8 to 1, that would be representation of something going down. Rather, we want to build up the sense of light and beauty and joy in our life. We present all of this mostly to focus on those 2 yellow words. What is this understanding? That Beit Shammai's Chanukah has something to do with Parei Hechag. Look at Steinsaltz, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, who wrote a classic and beautiful elucidation of the Talmud in Hebrew and in English. Look what he says. Do I have it in English here also?
No.
Sure. Okay, I'll just read. V'chad Amar, one of them says, Kitama shel Beit Shammai hu keneged parei hachag. The rationale for Beit Shammai's decreasing Chanukah, going from 8 to 1, has to do with the bulls of the holiday. Haparim, the bulls, shehikrivu, that they sacrificed, b'chag haSukkot, on the holiday of Sukkot. To which, again, your response is, what? Aren't we in Chanukah? What does this even mean? That Beit Shammai's Ferkakta Chanukah has to do with the number of bulls that were sacrificed on Sukkot? If we look closely at the way the Torah describes in Parshat Pinchas, the sacrifices on Sukkot, Shebeyom Harishon Hayu Makrivin Shlosha Asar Parim. On the first day of Sukkot, they would sacrifice 13 bulls. Uvechol Yom Hivchitu Par Echad. And every day, and you can look in the 29th chapter by Midbar and see it, they would reduce by one bull. And that's the explanation. Okay, so maybe that explains half of it or a third of it. It's true that on Sukkot, the number of sacrificed bulls every day is reduced, but it's not reduced from 8 to 1. And even more importantly, what is the connection between Sukkot and Chanukah? The only thing I want to pin on that is that Sukkot is a holiday, particularly if you add Shmini Atzeret on the end, which is 8 days, and Chanukah is a holiday that lasts 8 days, and maybe there's a stronger connection between those two than we thought. Rabbi Schatz?
So I have to give credit where credit is due. Rabbi Shapiro actually learned this text earlier last week and shared it with me. He was very excited to share it. And I had never heard this before. And when Rabbi Kligfeld and I were preparing for this class, this is exactly what we're talking about, that in the book of Maccabees, we don't have to read it. I mean, you can read it on your own if you want, but I'm going to explain what it says. In the book of Maccabees, it actually explains to us that as soon as the people were able to observe freely, that the first thing they did was they celebrated Sukkot, which, as Rabbi Kligfeld just mentioned, it's also 8 days. So it's possible that because they were celebrating Sukkot and then we decided to celebrate Chanukah based on what happened after the experience, I'll just call it, of Chanukah, that maybe that's where we got the 8 days, because they decided then to celebrate this Chag of Sukkot. And you'll see in the second verse on the page where it says Maccabees 10:10, they do all the things that we would expect them to do that we do on Sukkot, but they were doing it. I assume, maybe Rabbi Kligfeld, I don't assume that this was during the time of Sukkot, right? That this was just when they were able to celebrate. Is that true?
My understanding of the best guess of the history is that once the temple was rededicated and they had access to the ritual functions that they couldn't have when it was desecrated, right, they went back and did the most recent holiday they had missed. What's the most recent holiday they had missed? 7 days of Sukkot plus Shmini Atzeret equals 8. I see Alan's hand up. Alan, please, Vakasha. You say something?
That is exactly the case, because they were battling and they were otherwise weren't able to observe Sukkot. They made Hanukkah, when they were rededicating the temple, they observed it for the holiday of Sukkot that they couldn't do. Yeah. And also it's the 8 days that ties in from another way that I'm reading The Jewish Way by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and he noted that Solomon also had dedicated the temple in connection with Sukkot, and that dedication extended 8 days, as is understood from 1 Kings 8:66. So if that was their model of what was going on before, it would be consistent with having this model here of the dedication for 8 days of Sukkot and tying it into the Chag.
Good. Right, and if you remember from Parshat Shmini, the notion of 8 days being a period of time of dedication and the inauguration of the first priestly class, it's very possible that there were reasons for 8 associated with Chanukah, that a beautiful story of all oil was grafted onto, but may not have been the core reason for the original number of days. Joanna?
I'm finding such a contemporary relevance to this concept to the times that we're living in, because I've seen discussions in more traditional communities that won't get on Zoom on Shabbat about what are we going to do when we can gather again about all of the Torah readings that we've missed and we haven't done yet. So all of a sudden there's this whole aspect of, broader than, this one specific instance of Sukkot being missed. But what do you do when you can't observe a mitzvah at its proper time?
Yeah. And the Torah has some provision for that with respect to Pesach. Pesach Sheni was described so that if you were impure or were away when Pesach happened, and biblical Pesach was not a Seder, it was offering the sacrifice, you had an opportunity to do a redo. I remember when I was a rabbi in upstate New York for 9 years, a very hardy community. No matter what the weather, we would somehow find a way at least to get a minyan to show up to shul. There was one Shabbat where it was a blizzard. It was an utter blizzard. I lived in a house behind the synagogue. I kind of put on my snow clothes and my boots and came down to see if anyone showed up. There was one person who showed up, tried to get up the driveway. It was a very steep driveway in a Jeep, got halfway up, couldn't make it, and turned around and went home. So shul didn't happen. I remember discussing that week with the leadership and the ritual committee. Well, what did we do this coming Shabbat? I don't remember what Parsha was. Let's say it was Parshat, Shmot or something in the middle of winter. Does that mean that Congregation Eitz Chaim of Monroe just never got Parshat Shmot this year? What you're supposed to do technically, halachically, is that if a community in its entirety misses a davening, the next Shabbat, you're supposed to do a double Parsha. You're supposed to read that Parsha and the previous week's Parsha, which is what we did, because we figured this is a community that likes to come to shul and expects the Torah to be read. We read a full Kriya, and the following Shabbat, we did our own version of a double Parsha, it's called Tashlumin. It's the same thing when you miss an Amidah. If you're someone who davens 3 times a day, and there are all sorts of elaborate halachot about this, if you miss the Amidah of Shacharit, then when you come to Mincha, you're supposed to say the Amidah twice, even if that feels silly. So the notion of these religious, and I feel like I should be giving this back to Rabbi Schatz in a second, but the notion of these religious activists and religious zealots saying the temple is back in our hands, what should we do with it? We should do the very thing that we wanted to do a few months ago, but we're unable to, namely Sukkot. Rabbi Schatz, do you have more on that? Or do you want me to go to the next source?
The only thing I was going to say about this, that in putting Sukkot and Chanukah next to one another, especially based on the part from Masechet Shabbat that we just read about whether we should go up or go down in terms of numbers of candles, that when you think about a Sukkah, the Schach, by the 8th day of Sukkot, has dried out. It's withered away. And there is something sad about that, but it also, at least to me, signifies that, okay, now we're moving on to the next thing, that this home that we've created has done what it needs to do, and now we're moving on. Whereas with Chanukah, the way that we practice, according to Hillel, because we believe that the light should grow, there's almost a backwards association to Sukkot, that we are actually adding that light. And when we leave the holiday, we've sent even more of Hanukkah almost into the world. Then with Sukkot, we start off really strong and we end withered. And in fact, with Sukkot, we go into the next holiday immediately. And with Chanukah, there's obviously a break until the next holiday. And in terms of our theme of bringing light into the darkness, I had never thought about this until you talked about how on the 5th day it feels sad, that we really, we allow ourselves to celebrate this holiday looking forward to what we can do with that light after the holiday has come to an end, rather than imagining that we have all of that energy, that we have all the light at the beginning, and then it dwindles away, which somehow feels beautifully dissonant to Sukkot, but in a way that that still makes those two things connected.
So you might say that Beit Shammai's argument is a little more honest about what it feels like when the days of Hanukkah are getting towards the end, and it might be more based in the actual history of the circumstances, but as usual, Beit Shammai loses. The reason why we brought all of this up was really just to create a fissure, just to create a crack in the notion that we know for certain why the holiday is the number of days that it is. And through that fissure, through that crack, we're going to push a rather wide train, or rather not us, the Talmud itself. So in a different part of the Talmud altogether, Tractate Avodah Zarah, the tractate that deals with idolatry, is one of the only other places where there's even an obscure hint towards something having to do with Hanukkah, and it has to do with the discussion of their holidays, idolatrous holidays. So we have a Mishnah in this first chapter, Avodah Zarah. V'ilu idehen shel obdei kochavim. These are the names of the holidays of the idolaters, and you see in the word idehen. You might know that word in Latin, Ides, like the Ides of March, same word. right? These are their holidays. And they had names, Kalenda, and it's written out here in Hebrew as Saturnura. Most scholars would refer to this pagan holiday as Saturnalia, and Kratesis, and Yom Gnusia Shamalkehem, which is some festival related to their kings, the Yom HaLeida, and the king's birthday, the Yom HaMita, and when the king died, it's like the joke about when you say Tachanun, you don't say Tachanun if a rabbi died, if a rabbi was born on that day, which means that there's never really a good excuse to say Tachanun, because there's always some rabbi's birthday or yurtzeit. Did Rabbi Meir, that's what Rabbi Meir says. The sages say, Kol mita sheyesh ba sreifa, any death of a pagan king that had some kind of a public immolation or burning, yesh ba abudat kochabim, that holiday brings along with it the imprimatur of idolatry. V'she'ein ba sreifa, if it doesn't come with a public burning, ein ba abudat kochabim, it might be a significant day to them. We don't have to think of it as one of their yontifs. Aval yom tiglachat zikano uvlorito v'yom shalabo min hayam. All these significant days in a king's maturation or growing, or when he was saved from the sea. The yom she'yatzah mi beit ha'asurin, or a day that he was redeemed from prison. V'yoved kochavim she'asah mishter livno eno os asur ela oto hayom bo'oto ha'ish bilbad. So if there's these individual days, then you as a Jew, your obligation to not, because what this is in relationship to is your prohibition from doing any commerce with an idolater in the days leading up to or after their yontif, because God forbid you should do commerce with an idolater. They should feel grateful for that commerce, and then they thank their gods for having done business with you, and you have been a partner to idolatry. Okay, that's the context. Now the Gemara, a couple of hundred years later, starts looking at one of these holidays very, very in a very focused way. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rabba. Rav Chanan bar Rabba said, Kalenda, one of those that we mentioned above, a holiday called Kalenda, maybe it has to do with calendar, I'm not sure. Chet Yamim Achar Tkufa is 8 days after Tkufa. Tkufa is a Hebrew word that means a period of time. The best way to think of this here is a solstice, and what this is referring to is the solstice of Tevet, or the solstice, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Saturnalia chet yamim lifnei tkufa. And Saturnalia is 8 days before it. So the pagans had 8 days before the winter solstice, and they had a chag 8 days after the winter solstice. Okay. Where did this come from? Tanu Rabbanan. There's now going a jump back into another Tanaitic source. And now we have to get a window into the rabbis' understanding of primal history. Right? And the rabbis had no problem thinking of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, whom we're about to meet in the story, as having lived, having been real, having been more than kind of fantastic archetypes, but having had real experiences whose remnants still impact us today. Now remember, Adam Harishon, the first human being, was born just a few days after the world was born. According to Jewish tradition, when in the calendar year is the world born? Rosh Hashanah. Hayom Harat Olam. Hayom, 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 Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. Our tradition sees our people as having been born on Pesach. Our tradition sees the world as having been born on Rosh Hashanah. So the odometer of the world's history turns over Rosh Hashanah. So if the world was born on Rosh Hashanah, then Adam was born on the 6th of Tishrei, as it were, in the fall, in the season of the fall. So the Fisha Ra'a Adam Harishon, that the first person saw, Yom Shemit Ma'et V'holech. What happens? Imagine, whenever I read this text, I think of Tom Hanks in Castaway tracking the seasons on the wall of the cave. So imagine the first human being, and again, suspend factual disbelief for the moment and try to get into the emotions that we're going to ascribe to this person. He's born. He starts to get a sense of his world. He doesn't know anything about how the world operates, but he's taking track of time. And he's noticing that every day there's a little bit less light than there was, because from September 18th to September 20th to September 22nd to September 24th, the sun goes down a little bit earlier, and there is that much less amount of light. And no matter where you are in the world, right? The presence of the sun's light and the presence of the sun's warmth is something that you understand as being significant to living, to thriving. Amar, Adam said, Oily, oh my God, what am I going to do? This is terrible. Shema b'shvil shesarachti olam chashuch ba'adi. Maybe it's because of my sin. What sin? Having been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, having to live in a real world as opposed to in a perfected world. Maybe it's not only that I no longer live in the Garden of Eden, I live in a world that is dying. I live in a world that's getting darker and darker. And he's never yet lived through the full cycle, so he doesn't know that it's a cycle. All he notices, and it's getting darker and darker and darker. V'chozer letohu v'bohu, very Genesisian. It's going to return to the exact thing it was before God pulled life out of chaos, void and nothingness. The Zohi Mita, that's going to be my death. Sheniknasa an alai min hashemayim, that had been meted out from heaven for my not having followed God's instruction in the Garden of Eden. Amad, he got up, v'yashav chet yamim b'tanit. For 8 days he fasted, right? And you can imagine that he was getting really, really nervous when the days were getting really, really short, and he fasted for 8 days. I love the image. Primordial man, as a way of petitioning God to save him, engages in an act that eventually the Jew is going to raise up as the way that you show your humility and your penitence before God. Uva tefillah, it's added in, which may or may not be part of the original text. He fasts and he davens, please God, save me. Kevan shera'at kufat tevet. Once, and here the Hebrew kufat tevet is the rabbinic word for the winter solstice. Once he saw the winter solstice had passed, v'ra'a yom shemarich. He said, I think there's a little bit more light here than yesterday. I think December 23rd is slightly brighter than December 22nd. Amar, oh, I get it. Minhago shalolamhu. This is the way the world works. It ebbs and it flows. It gets darker and shorter, and eventually it's going to turn around and get lighter and longer. Asa shmona yamim tovim. He made a yantif. He counted for 8 days to make sure the pattern was continuing. L'shana ha'acheret, and the next year when it happened again, asa'an le'elu ve'elu yamim tovim. He said, you know what? I'm going to have a holiday leading up to the winter solstice, remembering when I was fasting because I wasn't sure if it was going to go okay. That's kalenda. And, or is that, I forgot which is which. That is kalenda. Oh, that's Saturnalia. And kalenda, Yamim Tovim hu kav'am l'shem shemayim behem kav'um l'shem avodat kochavim. So Adam says the next year I'm going to have 8 days of a holiday leading up, commemorating when I was fasting, asking for God's forgiveness. And then on the 8 days after the solstice, I'm going to have an 8-day party, a celebration, a bacchanalian feast of joy and of warmth and of light. And this is how the rabbis mention it without referring to Chanukah, but there's a wink here, I believe, and most scholars believe. Hu kav'am l'shem shamayim. When Adam did it, he established it for God's glory, for the glory of the single God who created the universe. The Haim, and they, the idolaters, the pagans, the people who don't get it, the people who understand reality very differently than us, Haim kavum l'shem avodat kochavim. They established it for idolatrous purposes. Okay, what are the rabbis saying here? What might the rabbis be saying here? First, they're saying that originally the pagan holidays that we, meaning they, in their era, were experiencing amongst the non-Jews of the generation, they didn't begin in it with a pagan source. They began with Adam Harishon, the first creation. And they began in a response to a darkening world. But secondly, I believe what's going on underneath the surface is they're saying Chanukah was preordained. Chanukah is not only at its core the Maccabees and the Chashmonaim and oil and even and military victory, and it's not even only not by night, not by power, which is what we discussed about this morning. Chanukah speaks to an earlier primal human urge. Adam Harishon put Chanukah in motion. The story just filled in the blanks later. From before there was a temple, before there was David, before there was Moses, before there was Jacob, before there was Abraham, there were our ancestors recognizing that in the deepest dark of winter's night, we need to light a candle, celebrate the fact that the earth is going to heal itself and get warmer and lighter. And even though we know it's the case that our holiday of Chanukah is based on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, it's also the case that our lunar calendar is intercalated to make sure that it keeps matching up with the solar calendar. So it always happens that our Festival of Lights happens in December, right? If we lived on a fully lunar calendar, as the Muslims do, then Hanukkah would occasionally appear in February and occasionally appear in June and occasionally appear in August, and it would lose some of its connection. But something, even though the official halachic answer for why our calendar is intercalated to make sure that Pesach always happens during spring, one of the results of that is that our Festival of Lights, like the pagan Festival of Lights, like the Christian Festival of Lights, like the Kwanzaa Festival of Lights, is taking place during the time of the year when the human soul is most in need of oil that lasts longer. This, I believe, is the rabbis winking at Beit Shammai, saying, Beit Shammai, you might be onto something. Even though we're not going to light our Chanukiot the way you do, we get that you have reasons to be suspicious that the reason that our holiday is 8 days long has something just to do with that miracle of the oil. There's something earlier that is informing that link. Larry, Diane?
So having lived for so many years in the Southern Hemisphere, all of this logic doesn't work. And it's not because of the weather, but because it's not the winter solstice. It's a time when the days are the longest. And I have to say that celebrating Hanukkah, but also some of the other holidays out of season is a very strange thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Adam got it wrong because Chanukah is the oily festival and Sukkot is the most minhagi festival.
Are you making an oil pun there, or is that unintentional?
No, I was making an oil pun.
Got it. Because if you weren't, I was going to suggest that you do. Perfect, right? So Diane, your kind of your conceptual discomfort with doing Hanukkah in the summer of wherever you are speaks to the rabbi's connection to this text, right? There's something about this holiday that has to be in winter's navel, right? And we're not the only one. Rabbi Schatz?
When we think about, I'm going to do the text at the bottom in a second so you can scroll all the way to the bottom. The part of this that is so interesting to me with the 8 days of the fast and then the 8 days of celebration is that in that text, when Rabbi Kligfeld mentioned how in Masechet Shabbat, it's like around 21 through 22 of Masechet Shabbat that we talk about the Hanukkah candles, the piece, and I wrote about this in Table of 5 if you want to read it this week, but the piece that talks about what we do on Hanukkah says all of these things happened, and then the next year they instituted Hanukkah. And before looking at this piece about Adam and Chava, I wondered, why the next year? You just had this amazing thing happen. Why not institute the holiday right then and there? Why not say Hallel and sing Al Hanisim and all of those things right in that moment when you're feeling it? Why wait an entire year? But there's something nicely connected to this piece about Adam and Chava, how you have to have perspective. You have to go through something to be able to actually say that was a miracle, or this was my learning so that I can do the Chag in its entirety in that next year. And so seeing this piece juxtaposed to the part of our tradition that we look to understand why and how we do Chanukah is a very interesting, it's a very interesting mirror one to the other. So we're going to end here talking a little bit about darkness and the light that is brought into the darkness. And because we're going to go into Chanukah, into Havdalah, another H word, we are going to talk a little bit about this phrase, La Yehudim Hayta Ora V'Simcha V'Sason Ve'ikar. We see this actually, as you can see on your page, we see this from Megillat Esther, right? That there is this moment where the Jews enjoy the light, the or, and the happiness, the gladness, it says here, simcha v'sason ve'ikar, because they are able to be who they want to be. Go out into the world and celebrate the religion that feels comfortable to them, that is theirs to celebrate, that they have freedom of religion, they have freedom of expression. And that comes with a sense of light. And when we do Havdalah, we use this phrase to remind us, not just because it says the word light, but that we need to put that back into the world. That we need to bring that light, that freedom that not everybody has, even today in 2020, back into the world, to be able to shed light on the religious freedoms and the freedoms really of expression that we all deserve to have. And Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who we've quoted a lot because unfortunately we lost him all too soon, wrote a beautiful sentence that I want to leave us with before I pass it back over to Rabbi Kligfeld if he wants to have the last word. What he writes is, for though my faith is not yours, and your faith is not mine, if we are each free to light our own flame, together we can banish some of the darkness of the world. So even if Chanukah did not originate from just a place of Jews wanting to bring light into the world, what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is teaching us is that it doesn't matter. And maybe it's even better that all of these different religions have ways of bringing light into the darkness. Because if we each bring that light into the darkness, then we have a brighter world, and a world that is full of many people wanting to see that darkness go away.
And we should continue to light our Chanukiot and celebrate our Jewish identity and our Jewish way of serving God and serving the world. And we should also look for opportunities in the present day and hints in the past, where the sages who bequeathed this beautiful particulars tradition to us also were looking for ways to connect, even back then, to universalist themes and to connect with all people who are trying to find light in the middle of darkness. We can do both simultaneously. We can reject the extremists who say that we have to jettison all things that keep us away from one another and simply merge into one undifferentiated melting pot. And we could reject those extremists who say we want nothing to do with people who are not like us. Okay? We can also identify with the human beings out there of all religious and cultural backgrounds who in the middle of December want to light a light in their homes and light a light in their hearts. And we can do so in our Jewish way and feel connected to the world population at the same time. And that is Persume Nisa. That is publicizing the miracle of being alive and being able to pull light out of dark.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.